It is the start of a new college football season, and for the first time, Stokastic is offering simulations for college football DFS. In this video, I'm going to break down everything that you need to know in terms of how to use our simulation tools. And if you want to sign up for them, there's a link down below in the YouTube description box. And if you like this content, like the video and subscribe to the YouTube channel. Now, where this is going to start is with the contest generator. This is where we actually build out the lineups that we're ultimately going to be simulating. Now, the options here at the top of the screen, site, pretty straightforward. This is supporting both DraftKings and FanDuel. Select whichever site you're playing on. Then for the slate, our sims support the main slates for college football. So have the slate select that you're going to be playing on. For pool size, what you want to be doing is selecting the amount of lineups that most closely resembles the field that you're playing in. Now, if you're in a contest that say has 10,000 lineups, you would select 5,000 because that is the closest number. Also, there's a couple of different subscription options. There's the core package that starts at $24.95. That allows you to build up to 1,000 lineups. And then the max package that starts at $39.95. That allows you to build up to 5,000 lineups. For the purpose of this video, I'm going to select 5,000 lineups. Now in here, we have the stack exposures. This is going to determine the different types of lineups that are going to be built. So 45% of lineups, single stack, 25% of lineups, double stack, 5% of lineups, a triple stack, and then 25% unstacked lineups. You don't really want to make any alterations to this because the purpose of the contest generator is to build lineups that emulate what the field is expected to do. And based on our research, this is the kind of lineups that the field plays and at these kind of percentages. So if you do ultimately decide when you're building your lineups, you only want to play single stacks or only want to play double stacks, those are alterations you can make on the Sims page, which we're going to be getting to in a little bit. But for the contest generator, I recommend you leave this at the default unless you have your own research that shows that there are slightly different numbers that you're expecting for any given contest. Team controls, another option you're generally not going to have to use, but there are situations where it may arise. This allows you to remove a team from the pool entirely. So let's say that there's something crazy that happens and a game gets canceled 5 minutes before lock or something. You could go in here and you could really quickly remove both teams from that game, and then none of those players will appear in your pool. We also have the contest archetype slider here. This is going to adjust some of the ownership based on the stakes you're playing at. The default is going to be the marquee, and marquee, that's your flagship contest on FanDuel and DraftKings. Think about the contest that has the biggest amount of entries, has the big prize to first place, usually something like a $150,000 prize pool. It's $50K to first place. That's typically going to be your marquee setting. If you're playing in something like a dollar contest or a quarter arcade, you'd select the low stakes setting for that. And then if you're playing in something like the 555 contest or $1,000 entry, then you'd select the high stakes setting. That will make it so that your contest pool is geared more towards our projected ownership for higher, lower dollar and buy-ins, depending on which thing that you select. And that should emulate which contest it is you're playing in. Once all of that is done, you can then select generate lineups, and that is going to build the lineups that it is based on these different selections that you made. And then also, if you ever want to restore a pool, if you guys saw here, there was a button here that said restore pool, and you could always restore the last pool you ended up building. Now, what is happening right here is 5,000 lineups are being built, and it's lineups that are being built to emulate what the field is expected to do. And that is what you want in the contest generator. You don't want it to have any kinds of crazy differences from the field. Any kind of customization to your lineups is going to be made after we simulate out the slate, which we're going to be doing in a little bit here. Now on the screen here, you're going to see our projected ownership as well as the pool exposure and the difference between the two. There shouldn't be very big differences. In general, the pool exposure is going to be very, very close to the ownership. And you'll see here, the player we have projected for the most ownership on the slate is Jamar Curtis at 67.4%. And then he showed up in exactly 67.4% of lineups. That's what you want to happen in the contest generator. You can change some of the ownerships here, but you only want to do that if you disagree with their ownership projections. So let's say you thought that Jamar Curtis is going to be lower owned than 67.4%. You can give him down arrows and then regenerate the pool of lineups. That'll rebuild the set with less overall ownership going to Jamar Curtis. What you don't want to do here, though, is if you want to get more or less of a player, you don't use the boost ownership for that. Any kind of customizations, we're going to be making those in a little bit. You don't make those customizations in the contest generator. So after your pool of lineups is built, we go to the simulate lineups page. Now on this page, Here's where you can make some customizations for the contest you're playing in. A couple of things you do want to make sure is that you have the site selected that you're playing on that matches the site that you're playing, as well as the slate that you're playing. You want that to match the slate that it is you're playing for the day. Now, percentage to first, this is going to depend on the contest you're playing in. Let's say the contest has a $100,000 prize pool and it's 25,000 to first. Well, 25,000 is 25% of 100,000. So you'd select 25%. And the selection you make here, you just want it to be the closest to whatever the payout to first is in your prize pool, because it is going to make some alterations to what project as the top lineups when we simulate out the slate. Another thing you could do here is you could upload custom projections, and pretty simple. You just upload a CSV that has three different columns. One that says player name, that's the name of all the players. One that says projection, that's your projection for those players, and then ownership, that would be your projected ownership for those players. If you get a CSV with those three columns, you just upload it right here, and that would automatically customize all of the projections on screen here to what it is that you are projecting for. The default is going to be our stochastic projections. And if you just want to make quick alterations to any individual player, you could do it simply like this. You could either type in a projection for a player, or you could just give them a plus. That'll give them +1 fantasy point. You could give them a minus. That'll give them -1 fantasy point. And if you want to reset it, you just press this button, and then it rewinds it back to our default projections. After you have everything set in terms of the projections you want, you're ready to simulate out the contest. And what you do for that is you just simply press Run Contest Simulation. Now, what is happening here is we are now simulating out the contest, and all of those lineups that we build in the contest generator, those 5,000 lineups, they're playing against each other 40,000 times. And every single time the slate is being simulated, it's on a play-by-play basis. So that's a great way to include things like correlation being considered into these lineups, things like the ownership of the individual players, because when all of these lineups that we build play against each other 40,000 times, they're being simulated in a tournament setting. And then each time that that lineup ends up playing, each lineup of those 5,000 ends up playing in a tournament, you end up finding out like, all right, so a lineup finishes in first or finishes in fourth. They're assigned a dollar amount for those. And then ultimately, when the simulation is done, which is just going to be in a few seconds, all of the lineups are going to be sorted based on the simulated ROI of each of those lineups. And that's based on the results of the 40,000 times that we simulated out the slate, based on all the settings that we put in, including the fantasy point projections, any customizations you made in the contest generator, and then also taking into account the percentage to first in the contest that it is that you're playing. And then after this is done, you're going to see the lineups are going to be defaulted to be sorted by our sim ROI metric, which is right here on the left-hand portion of the screen. And you'll see here the simulated ROI of each of the lineups, which is what I recommend you favorite lineups by, projected fantasy points, fantasy point projection for each of those lineups, projected ownership, the stacks that are in each of these lineups, the stack type. So you'll see here, this is a 2 because it's a Kansas double stack. And then here you'll see 2-1 because it's a KU double stack and then an NC State single stack. Then you'll see how often this lineup ended up winning a GPP across those 40,000 simulations, the percentage of time that it finished in the top 10 percentile of a contest, and then also the percentage of time that it cashed in a GPP setting. Now, what you want to do from here is favorite the amount of lineups you're playing. If you're playing 150, you favorite 150. If it's 20, you favorite 20. Or you can favorite a custom amount. So if you're playing 58 lineups, say, you can just type that number in here, and that would favorite your top 58 lineups. For this, I'm going to favorite the top 150 lineups. Now, from here, we've got a couple of different pages we could look at. There's the player ROI page. This is going to show you the expected ROI of each individual player across all of the lineups that we built out and simulated. You'll see the stack ROI. This is going to show of all of the different lineups we built, how the individual QBs and the players they're stacked with, how they ended up rating out. So you see like double stacks here. Shedeur Sanders had a 4.8% sim ROI, whereas the single and the triple stacks didn't rate out quite as well. Then there's the favorites page. This is just another page with all the top lineups we favorited. And then the exposures page. This is what's going to be most pertinent to us here in our simulations, because it is going to show us the amount of exposure we have in our top lineups of all the different players on the slate. So Jamar Curtis, for instance, he's our most rostered player. He's in 88% of lineups. You also see here the projected fantasy points for all of the different players, and then the pool ownership, which is essentially the ownership of the players. So when we've got Jamar Curtis here projected for 67.4% ownership, and he's in 88% of our lineups, it means we have 20.6% leverage because we're 20.6% overweight to the field. So if you want to see which individual athletes you're over underweight to, you could click on this column and you could see who you're rooting for and who to be rooting against on this slate. So RJ Harvey, for instance, here, he's projected for 14.3% ownership. He's only in 2.7% of my top lineups. So he's somebody that I'd be rooting against on this slate. And then you do the inverse as well. You can see the players that you're most overweight to. So this is just the default. If you're making no customizations of your own, which is a perfectly fine way to build your lineups, what you do from here is you would click Export Favorites and you get a CSV of all the lineups that you built out. But let's say you want to make some customizations. There's a few different ways we could do it. One of them was by making custom projections back on the projections page. Another thing you could do as well is ROI boosts. So let's use, for example, Jamar Curtis. He was in 88% of our lineups. And let's say you just want to get less of Jamar Curtis. There's a couple of different ways you could do it. One is you could go in here and you could just do negative whatever percent ROI boost that you want to do. If you go a bigger number, that would be more aggressive. For the purpose of this, I'll just put in a negative 10% ROI boost. I'll click Boost ROI. Then if you go back to the lineups page, you'll see every single lineup that had Curtis in it now is projected for a 10% less ROI. So if we unfavored our top lineups and then refavored our top 150 and then go back to our exposures, you'll see that we went from having 88% exposure of Curtis down to 80%. So it got him into a little bit less of lineups. But let's say there's a real distinct number of lineups that you want to have Jamar Curtis in. Also, if you ever want to undo any of these, you just click Clear Boosts and then Boost ROI, then go back to the lineups page, unfavor your top 150, refavor your top 150, and now we're back to the default 88% of Jamar Curtis. But another thing that we could do in here as well is you could stack entire teams. So let's just say you wanted more exposure to Missouri. You could go in here, you could boost them by something like 10%, then boost ROI, and then all lineups that have a stack of Missouri would then be getting a 10% ROI boost. But another way that you could limit the amount of exposure you have to individual players is, let's say that Jamar Curtis, you want 50% of them. That's what you're comfortable with. You don't want any more than 50% of Jamar Curtis. We could select 50%, then set exposures and adjust favorites. And what it'll do now is it'll only give you a maximum amount of 50% of Curtis. And so what it's going to do is, it's of those 150 lineups we built, the top 75 that have Jamar Curtis are going to get favorited. And then it's going to find the next best 75 lineups that don't have Curtis. So if you look back now at the exposures page, you'll see we have exactly 50% of Curtis because we capped his exposure at 50%. And then once again, if you wanted to undo that, you just go back into the exposures tab here, and then you go and find Curtis, and you could set him back to 100%. And then that would go back to having him uncapped, and you'd have him in whatever top amount of lineups that he shows up in. So that's the easiest ways that you could go about customizing your lineups. And it works the inverse as well, not just boosting players to make them lower owned in lineups. You can do the inverse to make them appear in more lineups as well. So take Micah Bernard here, for instance. Take note, we have him in 68.67% of lineups. I'll give him a 15% ROI boost. And now when we favorite our top lineups, we're going to be getting to more exposure to him. Now he's at 82.7% of lineups. So we got about 14% or so more there of Micah Bernard. And then after you're done making whatever customizations you want to your lineups, click the Export Favorites button, and that is going to give you a CSV of all your lineups that you can copy and paste and write over your set of lineups that you already have on DraftKings FanDuel, wherever you're playing. And that's it. Nothing else really to know about The Sims. It's very complicated on the back end, but for the user, it's actually really simple. It's really fun to use as well. You can easily customize your lineups. If you have any questions about this at all, let me know down below in the YouTube description box, and I'll check some of those out. Other than that, hope you guys have a great college football season. And if you haven't done yet, like this video and subscribe to the YouTube channel.